Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in a couple of minutes as people file into the waiting room. As you see, I am forced to do this outside, but I hope that doesn't interfere with anything. We're here to talk about Poland and Hungary, and I'm going to share my screen. Hungary and Poland, and the triumph and defeat of Trump's European counterparts. We have Q&A function. If you'd like to ask some questions, and we'll just let this continue for a few more minutes as people file in. Once again, my name is John Pfeffer, and I am the Director of Foreign Policy and Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. And this is part of our series on the rise of authoritarianism around the world. I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a moment and make sure that folks are all here. We have a good crowd. Again, we have a Q&A function. If you have questions at any point during the presentation, please put your open questions there. And I think we'll just get started. I'm going to talk for about a half hour to 45 minutes, and then we will get some questions from you all. Back to sharing my screen. Good. So our topic today is Hungary and Poland, two countries in East Central Europe. Hungary, a country of about 10 million people, Poland, a country of about 40 million people. These have been at the forefront of this question globally about the rise of the far right, its success politically, and efforts to push back against it. So I want to start by looking at where we are today with this question of the political situation, the economic situation in Poland and Hungary, and its relationship to the United States, and more specifically, the Trump administration. Now, of course, many of you have heard of Viktor Orban. He's the Prime Minister of Hungary. He's been the Prime Minister of Hungary since 2010, when he was elected for a second time with his party Fidesz. And there's a good chance that he will be elected once again in Poland's next election, which will take place in 2020. I'm sorry, in Hungary's next election, which will take place in 2026. And I'm, of course, going to go into some background about who Viktor Orban is, but he has been perhaps one of the most successful democratically elected far-right leaders. And so his relationship with Donald Trump has been very strong, and uh, and the Hungarian model that he has innovated has proven very successful, not only in Hungary, at least in terms of winning elections, but has been imported into Poland, and by many estimates has served as a model for Project 2025, the blueprint for Donald Trump returning to office this year. However, the popularity of Fidesz, and that is Viktor Orban's party, has been declining. And as you'll see from this chart, a newcomer on the political stage in Hungary, Tisza has, or Tisza has overcome the popularity of Fidesz. The big question is whether it will be able to maintain that lead of anywhere from 8 to 15 percentage points going into next year's election. And the major reason why Tisza has become so popular is the rise of this man, Peter Magyar. And Peter Magyar is not the founder of Tisza, but he did become part of the party in 2024 and has been electrifying crowds throughout Hungary. He has the advantage, of course, of his last name. Magyar, of course, is Hungarian for Hungary or Hungarian. So he has kind of credentials right in his name to appeal, at least to nationalists. But he also is has been a member, was a member of Fidesz, so he was a political insider. He was close to many people, the inner circle of Viktor Orban, and so his decision to abandon Fidesz and run against Fidesz is, of course, seen as a betrayal by Viktor Orban, but it also gives him a certain amount of credibility among people who were previously Fidesz supporters and now are disgusted with the situation in Hungary and want some kind of alternative. Magyar, of course, was also married to somebody who was high up in the Fidesz administration, former Minister of Justice, Judith Varga. They got divorced, so he basically was engaged in a double divorce. He divorced Judith Varga, and he also divorced himself from Fidesz as well. So this is the situation in Hungary, a kind of finally the opposition seems to have found somebody that they think can win against Viktor Orban after 16 years or so of Viktor Orban being the head of Hungarian politics. And so there's a good deal of excitement in Hungary among the opposition, but of course there's also pushback by Fidesz, by Orban, in order to maintain power. Okay, so that's the situation. In Poland, we have the return of Donald Tusk. And Donald Tusk is, a long-time politician in Poland, has been running for office for many years. He left Poland to become the president of the European Council. And he managed in 2023 to become the prime minister, ending the reign of the Law and Justice Party, Law and Justice. And he was able to do so not by his party actually winning in the election. His party actually lost, and Law and Justice won the most votes in 2023, but Law and Justice didn't win enough votes to form a government. And Tusk and his civic platform was able to form a coalition government, but has been blocked from basically implementing many of the reforms that Donald Tusk promised that he would introduce by the Polish president. And the Polish president was, of course, Andrzej Duda, a member or affiliated with the Law and Justice Party, the Conservative Party. And so there was a tug of war at the very heights of Polish politics since 2023, and there was great hope that um, that the Tusk party would run in the elections this year, the Polish presidential elections, and score a victory so that finally the prime minister and the president would be from the same party and they could implement their program. But that's not what happened. And in fact, what you saw was a real decline in popularity of the Tusk party, of Koalicja Obywatelska, or the Civic Coalition or Citizens Coalition, and the continued popularity of the right-wing government of peace, of law and justice. And as you see from this graph, they basically are neck and neck. And that is in fact what happened in the presidential election as well this year. Karol Nawrocki, who was the law and justice candidate, the right-wing candidate, managed to win by just the smallest margin, just less, basically a percent or so of the vote. And so now again, you have this kind of tug of war at the very height of Polish politics between the prime minister and president. You had just before the elections a meeting in Poland of the Conservative Political Action Conference and the endorsement of Karol Nawrocki by Trump administration officials, including here Kristi Noem, the head of Homeland Security. It was basically an all-out press by the Trump administration to ensure that their right-wing supporters in Poland would win the presidency. And that could perhaps have been just the amount of energy necessary to push Nawrocki over the line to win in the presidential elections. You saw something similar with the alliance essentially between Donald Trump and Viktor Orban in Hungary. And so you have at the very top, you have this kind of alliance between Trump and right-wing governments and politicians around the world, but a real all-out push to support the right wing in Hungary and Poland. And in part because this has been a strategy of the Trump administration to weaken the European Union and to find kind of leverage points in Europe to do so. And Viktor Orban has been a kind of stalwart opponent of what he calls the overreach of the European Union. And his government, the Hungarian government, has been the subject of many European Union efforts to defend democracy, rule of law, putting restrictions on European Union funding for Hungary. The same was true during the Law and Justice period when they were in charge in Poland before Donald Tusk won in 2023. And so Donald Trump has essentially identified political actors in the European space who can help him undercut the power of the European Union. And we can go into why Donald Trump is so interested in doing that shortly. So I want to go back in time a little bit to understand how we got here, how we got to this situation of the far right taking over in Poland and in Hungary. In 1989, of course, there were the great changes that took place in Eastern Europe, fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, preceded by transformations in Poland and in Hungary. In Poland, you had a kind of half democratic election in June of 1989. You had the formation of the first non-communist government in Poland in the fall, in September of 1989. And that government was led by Tadeusz Mazowiecki, prime minister. But it was a divided government, similar in some sense to the divided government we see in Poland today. But at that time, it was divided between the Solidarity trade union-backed Mazowiecki government and the president, who at the time, of course, was still Wojciech Jaruzelski, the general who was famously responsible for declaring martial law in Poland in 1980 and a stalwart of the Communist Party. So finally, in 1990, there was an opportunity to replace Jaruzelski with a non-communist candidate. And the 1990 presidential election was very much anticipated within Poland and the world as a kind of indication of the, if you will, the burial once and for all of communism in Poland and the region. And you had three candidates. You had Tadeusz Mazowiecki, who of course was the prime minister, now running for president, an intellectual, very prominent in Catholic circles, solidarity efforts in the late 1980s to dislodge communist governments. So Tadeusz Mazowiecki, a kind of a famous and very respected leader. The second candidate was, of course, Lech Wałęsa. Lech Wałęsa, the electrician who had largely started Solidarity trade union effort in 1980 and was able to mobilize, a huge number of Poles, at one point 10 million members out of a population of 40 million people, 10 million members of Solidarity, and from 1980 until 1981, just galvanized this reform movement within the communist bloc before, as I said, Jaruzelski declared martial law in 1981. So Wałęsa, winner of the Nobel Prize, again, a world-renowned figure running for the presidency against Mazowiecki. But there was a third candidate in that election, and his name was Stanisław Tymiński, a little-known figure, and no one took his candidacy very seriously. He was a millionaire businessman who had emigrated to Canada and was returning to Poland in order to run for president. And he was very much an outsider. He was obviously not part of the Solidarity movement. He had not been part of the changes that took place in Poland at the time. And he was also rather bizarre in many of the statements that he was making. He was a populist. He was not, kind of referring to any particular facts necessarily. And he was spouting a lot of conspiracy theories. Ultimately, he was accusing Lech Wałęsa of being a paid informer for the secret police, which actually turned out not to be so much a conspiracy theory, but there was some truth behind it. But many of the other things he said during the campaign were outlandish, and no one really expected that he would get very far in this election. But a big surprise, when the first round took place, only two winners emerged, and those two winners were not Wałęsa and Mazowiecki, the two people with these great reputations, but rather Wałęsa and Tymiński. And Mazowiecki lost. Now, why did this happen? Why did this kind of important figure in the Polish opposition lose to this crazy millionaire populist outsider who was spouting conspiracy theories, a kind of a Trump-like figure well before Trump entered politics? And to understand this bizarre outcome in the Polish presidential elections of 1990, we have to turn to the economic situation in Poland. And the economic situation in Poland at that time helps to explain not only the ability of someone like Tyminski to make it into the second round, but it helps to understand the whole rise of the far right in the region. If we look at the Polish GDP, which, it looked at in the overall picture, it looks like it's just, it's going up. It's the golden era of the Polish economy, according to many academics. This was unprecedented prosperity. But this unprecedented prosperity doesn't begin until later in the 1990s. In other words, from 1989, when the first semi-democratic elections take place, into 1990, when you had the first democratic presidential elections, Poland was experiencing this rather remarkable drop in economic prosperity, a rather significant one. Now, you could also look back to 1980 and understand the rise of solidarity as a response to the economic crisis in Poland in the late 1970s. So a kind of similar return of economic crisis, producing rather interesting, if you will, political results. But it wasn't just the Polish economy overall. Specifically, it was unemployment. And if you look all the way here at the left-hand side of 1990, unemployment, which is basically non-existent in Poland under communism, where everyone was supposed to have a job, from practically zero, it goes up very, very rapidly within a matter of months. So that by the time you had the election of 1990, the presidential election of 1990, huge numbers of Poles have been thrown out of work. And there was the introduction of soup kitchens for the first time. And who was to blame for this? Well, you couldn't blame it on the communists any longer because the communists were no longer in power. But you could blame it on Tadeusz Mazowiecki and this solidarity government. And so this is what is the reason. This is the reason why Tadeusz Mazowiecki loses in the first round of the Polish presidential election. So why was there this dip in the Polish economy? Why was there this crisis? Why was there this rather rapid increase in unemployment? Well, it's a result of what was called shock therapy or overnight capitalism, which was largely drawn from the recommendations of economist Jeffrey Sachs, who in those days was a very different political figure, very mainstream in his political views, and had recommended that it was necessary, if you were going to make the transition from communism to capitalism, to do so as quickly as possible. As they said in Poland at the time, if you're going to cut the tail off a cat, you should do it with one stroke rather than a number of different strokes. In other words, if there's going to be pain associated with an economic transition, then you should do it as quickly as possible to make sure that the pain is telescoped. Now, the other reason why they wanted to do it as quickly as possible was in order to prevent any kind of political backlash. They were afraid that if they introduced these political measures, that they would obviously produce political backlash, and that there would be attempts by political parties to stop the economic transition. So that as quickly as possible. Then, of course, you could do it within a 4-year or a 5-year period of time, the length of a usually, prime minister or a 5-year presidency. And as a result, the Polish economy contracted, unemployment surged. You had an enormous amount of pain that was suffered by Polish citizenry. But what you had as well was a eventual political reaction. Initially, of course, you had a solidarity government. You had Wałęsa, who did eventually win that presidential election by a convincing margin against Stanislaw Tyminski, and Tyminski kind of disappears again, returns to Canada, doesn't play any role although his legacy as a kind of populist, conspiracy-minded politician does live on in many ways, not only in Poland, not only in the region, but as we see in Donald Trump and other Trump-like figures around the world, in this kind of rise of far-right authoritarianism. But you also had a backlash, and you did get the backlash. It came after most of the shock therapy measures had already been pushed through, but eventually Polish voters vote for the former communists, the Left Party, and Aleksander Kwaśniewski becomes president for 2 terms from 1995 until 2005, and so you do have political pain that or a political response to the economic pain and the return of the former communists. But interestingly, the reforms are almost all completed in terms of the most significant ones by 1995. And you have the reform communists essentially continuing those neoliberal reforms anyway, and opening up Poland to the global economy. One could argue that this kind of industrial strength version of economic reform is a form of globalization. In other words, it's a reduction of regulations, it's a reduction of the state's involvement in the economy, it's a harmonization of a national economy with global rules and regulations. It's an attempt to facilitate the free flow of goods, services, and money across borders. So the reforms that take place in Poland and throughout the region in the early 90s are, in a sense, a kind of form of globalization. But it's telescoped and it's done very quickly, again, in order to overcome potential political responses. But you have eventually a new kind of right-wing party that emerges in Poland with the Law and Justice Party. And the Law and Justice Party begins in 2001. It's formed by 2 brothers, which I'll get to in a moment. And in the space of 4 years, it manages to come very close to eclipsing all other parties. You see the red line, the former communists, their support is cratering, and at the same time, the far right Law and Justice Party is increasing, coming head to head with, again, Donald Tusk's, in this case, Civic Platform, the predecessor of his current Civic Coalition. And these are the 2 brothers, the twin brothers behind the rise of Law and Justice, Lech and Yaroslav Kaczynski, who are initially close to Wałęsa, and Wałęsa's kind of gradually further to the right solidarity movement. But even the Kaczynskis are too much for Wałęsa. He kicks them out of his party because they are they too are spouting conspiracy theories, much not unlike Stanisław Tymiński. So the Kaczynski brothers managed to achieve an electoral win in 2005 in the parliamentary elections, and they go on to become president in the case of Lech Kaczynski and prime minister in the case of Yaroslav Kaczynski. So what is this peace model? In other words, the Law and Justice model, the right-wing model in Poland. What makes it so successful? Well, the first thing is, and this is a kind of interesting parallel between Poland, Hungary, and the United States. There's an initial failed term in office. In other words, in 2005 to 2007, Law and Justice attempts, to reform Poland, to push Poland in the direction that it wants to push it in, and it fails to do so. But in so doing, it learns something. It learns how to use the system more effectively. And it learns how to short circuit the system more effectively. This is the same thing that Viktor Orban learns in his first prime minister tenure from 1998 to 2002, before he then again returns in 2010 to today. And it's again something that Donald Trump learns in his first presidency. He learns what are the limits, what are the challenges congressionally, what are the mistakes he made by bringing in people who are not loyalists. So in all of these cases, the right-wing leaders learn something in their first term in office. The second important thing about Law and Justice is that they are not right-wing necessarily in terms of their economic positions. And in fact, they have learned that an embrace of neoliberalism, either by the center right or even by the former communists in Poland, is politically a poison pill. That they are going to learn how to, in the case of Law and Justice, take some of the actual economic positions from the left for a stronger government, for stronger social welfare policies, and absorb them into their platform, their otherwise right-wing platform. And when I was in Poland doing interviews at that time, I had a long conversation with Ryszard Bugaj, who Bugaj had been a left-wing economist. He had been associated with the left wing of the Solidarity trade union movement. But he had decided that, here was a political opportunity with the rise of Law and Justice to have an impact on government policy in a way that he hadn't before. And so he helped them craft these kind of left-wing policies. And some of those policies, when Law and Justice returned to power later in the 2000s, after their failed initial attempt, included generous tax policies for young people, for families, stronger health care for workers. So it was a combination of what had been kind of progressive economic positions on a stronger welfare society with some of those other nationalist positions that Law and Justice took, classically far-right positions. In other words, and I'll get to this in a moment, Law and Justice was defending those who had been left behind by the economic policies of the shock therapy era. Law and Justice was explicitly nationalist and xenophobic, anti-globalist. It embraced a very conservative social agenda, anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ, very pro-religion, Catholicism, of course. And they were very interested in concentrating power in the hands of the executive, in both the prime minister and the president. And they imposed controls on freedom of press, independent judiciary, which got them in trouble with the European Union, which started conditioning aid. What makes Law and Justice different from the Hungarian case is that it was also very much anti-Russian, and that goes back into kind of deeper sources in Polish history, but I can talk about that later. But ultimately, what we were talking about was a real division in Poland between Poland A and Poland B. And this is the phrase that Poles use to describe this. And you'll see from this electoral map from the 2019 parliamentary elections, and this is maybe the high point of Law and Justice's power in Poland, when it received 43% of the vote. You can see that the map is basically all dark blue or blue, maybe light blue in some areas, and that's all Law and Justice. And then the orange and yellow sections are for the Civic Coalition, or Donald Tusk's party, kind of a centrist party, essentially, even a little bit to the right in the European context. But you can figure out, perhaps if you know the geography of Poland, that these orange sections are cities. This one in the middle, of course, is Warsaw, and then you have Kraków, you have Gdansk up in the north, other cities as well, Poznan. These are the centers of liberal political sentiment in Poland. And so you understand that Poland A and Poland B is not just a split between city and countryside, although the countryside is in large part supportive of Law and Justice. It's also an east-west split where the Law and Justice is much stronger in the east as opposed to the west. It's also stronger Law and Justice among retirees, older population, people who are unable to make an easy transition during the shock therapy period. And so this division between Poland A and Poland B, you can find throughout the region. There is a Hungary A and Hungary B, a Slovakia A and Slovakia B, and of course, as I'm sure many of you would understand, a United States A and United States B as well. As I said, in the 2023 elections, Law and Justice lost its control of Polish politics, even though it won the election. Even though Law and Justice won the most seats, 194, it had lost enough seats so that it could no longer form a government. And so the Civic Coalition forms a government with the left and the Third Way. And that's the situation you have where Donald Tusk becomes prime minister again, though he has to, of course, deal with a Polish presidency still controlled by Law and Justice. So how did Tusk do it? How is Donald Tusk and Civic Coalition able to break the hold of the far right in Poland? Well, in the 2023 elections, we saw record turnout, nearly 74%. It was the most people who had voted in an election since 1919, and a large number of young people came out. People felt that it was time for a change. Law and Justice had been in power since the mid-2010s, and they were tired of this. They were especially angry about Law and Justice's anti-abortion position. There were huge protests throughout Poland. They were upset about the handling of COVID by Law and Justice, similar to one of the major reasons why Donald Trump lost the election in 2020. And I'll skip the other two. The other important issue is the return to Europe. And Europe had put conditions on aid to Poland because of Law and Justice's efforts to restrict press freedom and to control the judiciary. And so Donald Tusk could say, hey, I used to be the president of the European Council. I can help us get that money back. I can help bring Poland back to Europe. Okay, so let me go a little more quickly through the situation in Poland, in Hungary, rather. So again, let's begin in 1989, as we did with Poland. And here we have a picture of Viktor Orban, and he is giving a speech at the reburial of Imre Nagy, who had been the leader of the Hungarian uprising in 1956, had been executed, and this was a reburial of Imre Nagy in 1989, a demand of the opposition to the communist government. And there were, a great number of opposition heroes and stars who gave speeches at this reburial. And Viktor Orban was an unknown. He was a young man. He was a law student. And he got up there and he gave a fiery speech condemning the communists and also calling for the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Hungary and the region. And this made his name. And on the basis of this newfound fame, he gathered together other law students and young lawyers and other reformers, and he created a new party, which he called Fidesz, which was the Alliance of Young Democrats. And so there were two major liberal parties in Hungary at the time, the Alliance of Democrats, SDS, and then the Alliance of Young Democrats, or Fidesz. And Fidesz at the time was a kind of combination of radicals and liberals and alternative-minded people, a lot of young people. It was a very exciting party. It was very irreverent. And I attended a summer camp for Fidesz in 1990 when I was there. And it was just extraordinary. You know, you felt like this was the next generation of leaders who would come in. Their hands were clean. They had no involvement in politics in the past. They had a refreshing view of how to transform Hungarian politics and society. Here we have a picture. This is Viktor Orban in the bottom right. This is Susanna Szeleny, one of the, I think she was still in university when she was elected to parliament, one of the youngest members, and Tamás Deutsch, I think this is in the bottom left, all Fidesz leaders. But Fidesz breaks apart very quickly. There are accusations of corruption by Orban and others, and people like Szeleny leave the party, and Viktor Orban takes over with his coterie of supporters, and he watches the same thing happen in Hungary that happened in Poland. In other words, a little bit later, of course, but still an extraordinary increase in unemployment from practically zero to 8% in the space of a year, and the same dip in Hungarian economy. Here again, you have this drop, very similar to the drop in the Polish economy, and again, it's because Hungary embraces a shock therapy model, an overnight capitalism model as quickly as possible, and the political victims of that are the liberal parties, because the liberal parties, both SDS and Fidesz, are the primary supporters of this transformation. Fidesz under Orban decides that he's going to abandon liberalism. He's going to move all the way over to the right side of the political spectrum because that's where the opportunity is. And by 1998, when he becomes prime minister for the first time, he's already kind of solidly on the right wing of the Hungarian political spectrum. He attacks the liberals for their failed economic policies. He provides the same kind of nationalist and xenophobic policies that Law and Justice were famous for in Poland, conservative social values around abortion, again, LGBTQ, and concentrates power in the hands of himself as prime minister. Also, an economic patronage system in which the government is rewarding Fidesz members and their allies. And interestingly, despite his speech back in 1989 condemning the Soviet Union, Orban decides that Vladimir Putin is now going to be his role model, someone who is promoting an illiberal agenda in Russia, and so he positions Hungary as a kind of outpost, if you will, for Russian influence in the European Union. Vladimir Putin is very interested in undercutting European power, and Hungary is his ally in doing so. And here we have a similar map of Hungary A and B, similar to in Poland, but of course even more extreme because we have orange representing Fidesz and their allies dominating virtually the entire country, with the exception of Budapest and maybe one or two other cities. But this, the dominance of Fidesz is overwhelming compared to Law and Justice. I mean, Law and Justice might have gotten, close to 50%, but Fidesz, in part because of the peculiarities of the Hungarian electoral model, is able to win 66.8%, a supermajority in parliament, which gives Fidesz and Viktor Orban the ability to change the constitution and avoid any kind of veto by the opposition. And he does that successfully several times, changing the constitution, for instance, to assert that marriage between a man and a woman is the only marriage that is acceptable from the Hungarian point of view. But it's been a long time since Viktor Orban has been prime minister. It's been 16 years. And as I said, there's a new party on the political horizon, TISA. And as you see from here, TISA has now moved ahead in voter preferences by a considerable margin. Whether that's enough to guarantee that they will win in the elections is another question, but it's still an important sign of weakness on the part of Viktor Orban. Now, how did TISA and Peter Magyar, the leader in TISA, how did he do this? How did he come from virtually nowhere and galvanize an opposition which has been singularly unsuccessful in challenging Viktor Orban over the last 16 years? Well, he's young. You saw from his picture, he's 44 years old. He looks even younger than that compared to Orban at 62. He's a former insider, so he knows what he's talking about. He can appeal to former Fidesz voters who are discouraged by what has been happening in Hungary. All of those people who have not benefited from Fidesz's patronage system are pissed off. They have not gotten the benefits of Fidesz leadership, and so he can mobilize those. The Hungarian economy has been stagnant for the last couple years. Inflation has been high. It's come down more recently a little bit, but it's still pretty high, and the economy is simply not growing. There's an enormous antipathy towards corruption. And so Magyar has been able to mobilize an anti-corruption platform. He's been populist, he's been positive, he's been conservative. So he's no radical, he's no leftist, he's not even really a centrist, to be honest. He's pretty conservative, but still people see him as an alternative, and as in Poland, they see him as an opportunity to rejoin Europe. Of course, Hungary is a member of the European Union, but they have been penalized because of Orban's political decisions, and they believe that Magyar can bring Hungary back and get those funds back as well, and that could help the Hungarian economy. Okay, so let's finish up here with a discussion of the Trump factor. Here we have the Conservative Political Action Conference meeting in Hungary in 2025. It took place this spring, and these are the leading lights of the far right movement globally. Of course, Viktor Orban on the left, and you have the leader of the Alternative for Deutschland in the middle. And you have Robert Fico from Slovakia, and you have Donald Trump. And this is, some of you might remember back during Trump's first term, there was an effort by Steve Bannon to bring together the far right globally, especially in Europe. And he was not able to do so. And he wasn't able to do so in part because the far right in Europe has a lot of disagreements with one another, especially over Russia. But here it seems as if Donald Trump thinks that he can, and the Conservative Political Action Committee can do what Steve Bannon failed to do back during Trump's first term, and that's unify the far right. And not only in Europe, I mean, you have at this CPAC conference in Budapest, representatives of the Spanish far right, Vox, you have Geert Wilders, the Dutch far right leader of the Freedom Party, which in Austria, but you also have folks from outside of Europe, from the Likud, you have someone from the former Australian Prime Minister, John Eastman, kind of a key Project 2025 person. So a real effort to not only buttress the support for Viktor Orban, but globalize his support as well. There have been a number of arguments that the Hungarian blueprint that was created by Fidesz, that the attempts to transform Hungarian culture and make it considerably more conservative, anti-LGBT, anti-abortion, pro-family, so to speak, very Christian. The attempts to put limits on the judiciary or to control the judiciary, put limits on press freedom, attacks on universities, that this Hungarian model was a great inspiration for Project 2025. And that the Hungarian model in some ways is for the far right today what Islamophobia and kind of the anti-terrorism agenda was for the right wing, say in the Bush years. But instead of Islamophobia, instead of Islam, instead of terrorists, you have a woke agenda and you have globalists. And so what had been previously an external enemy, the Muslims out there, the terrorists out there, and if they are attacking us from within, they're still an other, to completely the notion that the enemy is us. The enemy are people within our society who are globalizers, like George Soros, or you have the woke people, like representatives in Congress, the Squad, etc. And that this is the battle for the soul of the West. And that's why the far right here in the United States has to partner with leaders like Viktor Orban and Law and Justice in Poland for the defense of the West against woke ideology and globalizers. What has Trump already done to help Viktor Orban in this case? Well, in his attacks on USAID, he also leaked information about which institutions, in which US institutions and which US foundations, including the Open Society Foundation, supported which anti-Orban forces in Hungary, which basically provided Orban with a list of organizations that he could go after and ban. And Hungary has tried, Orban has tried to introduce a foreign agent law, very similar to what Putin has implemented inside Russia, which would effectively shut down civil society. There were huge protests, and so now it's on pause, but they're going to restart the efforts to get that passed in September. Trump has also, basically said hands off any kind of anti-democratic efforts globally. So it doesn't matter what Orban would do in Hungary or Nawrocki in Poland. He has indicated, for instance, his support for Nayib Bukele in El Salvador and his effort to, basically be leader for life, that the United States is no longer going to uphold rule of law or support democracy anywhere in the world. The wrinkle in this, of course, are the tariffs, because Hungary is going to be hit hard and is being hit hard by Trump's tariffs because Hungary is a member of the European Union, and the European Union is going to be hit hard even with the deal that was recently negotiated. And that's going to be problematic for the economy, and that's going to be problematic for Orban's chances to win in the election next year. I'll skip over this. Poland is going to have an election in 2027, another parliamentary election, and it would be nice to believe that Tusk's victory in 2023 puts him in good stead to win again. But again, because Law and Justice and Nawrocki control the presidency, it's going to be very tough for the Tusk government to implement the reforms they want to implement. They have been able, of course, to get money back from the European Union, as the European Union has unfrozen those funds, and so the Polish economy has benefited from that. But you can see from the public opinion polls that that Law and Justice, Peace, and KO, or the Citizens Coalition, are running neck and neck, and more significantly, far right parties, Confederacja, the KKP, have considerable support in Polish society. These are parties that are even further to the right of Law and Justice. And the left parties, Lewica, the left party, Razem, together, only come up to half of the far right's vote total. So it's clear that Law and Justice, if the election were held today, could form a government quite easily with far right partners. So finally, the lessons from Poland and Hungary. What can we learn here in the United States from the successes, for instance, of Donald Tusk in defeating Law and Justice in Poland in 2023, and the current success of Peter Magyar in Hungary in challenging Viktor Orban? So I think the first is anti-corruption. In both cases, the opposition, the centrist opposition, the reform opposition, was able to say that these governments by the far right are corrupt, and that they are funneling money into the pockets of themselves and their cronies. And I think that's a winning strategy here in the United States too, even though Elon Musk is no longer such good friends with Donald Trump. Trump has, there's a most recent New Yorker article, was able to so far funnel about $3.5 billion into the pockets of himself and his family, but money through tax reforms and other government regulatory changes, money is flowing into the pockets of some of the wealthiest benefactors of the Trump administration. So I think the anti-corruption, the anti-1% argument can be very successful here in the United States. But I think it has to go beyond that to make arguments about recapturing the votes of those who are left behind by economic transition. And those left behind in Eastern Europe by overnight capitalism overlap with those left behind by globalization and the economic changes wrought by globalization. Blue-collar workers who have lost jobs, people who can't make the adjustment to a new economic reality, small businesses that have been hurt by tariffs, et cetera. The opposition in the United States has to take that lesson from Poland and Hungary, that they're not going to win unless they appeal to all the people who felt betrayed by neoliberalism or liberalism, depending on how they define it. So recapturing those votes is critical. Obviously the United States is not a member of the European Union, so we can't use that as an argument that if we vote in someone to replace Trump, that they will facilitate the transfer of funds from the European Union, because that's certainly an argument that was successful in Poland and Hungary. But I think you can emphasize the costs of angering our allies, whether it's Canada and Mexico, South Korea and Japan, or the European Union. There are considerable economic and political and geopolitical costs associated with angering those allies, and repairing those relationships can be a strong argument for anti-Trump forces. And then I'll skip over hypocrisy for a moment. Populism, an element of populism, which we've seen been successfully used by Bernie Sanders and AOC, Mamdani in New York. Populism, if used wisely, I think can be extraordinarily successful. That certainly is what Peter Magyar is learning in Hungary, but also staying positive. So not just having a negative campaign, though God knows there's plenty of negative things we can say about the Trump administration, but staying positive in terms of positive energy, positive proposals, and really contrasting the apocalyptic tone of the Trump administration and his nonstop negativity. So I'm going to stop there. And see how we're doing. Yeah, we're out of that. Um, and switch over to taking some questions. If folks have any questions, I'm going to take my glasses off so I can read any questions you might have. And you don't have any questions. So uh, I am going to wait a little bit and see if anybody does have any questions. We can always just end this a little early, unless I've given a lot of information, so I am not. Well, we are at 1:30 and we can close this out. Oh, a question. So outside of radical parties or electoral politics, what advice or lessons can ordinary organizers take from others in Hungary and Poland? Um, so that's a good question. One of the challenges I think that we face here in the United States is similar to challenges faced by activists in Hungary and in Poland is um, if we mobilize in the streets in huge numbers, do we provide an authoritarian leaning government with the pretext for invoking, say, the Insurrection Act and sending in the National Guard? So certainly that's what Trump has tried to do in Los Angeles and is currently attempting to do in Washington, D.C. Um, it was a response to protests, obviously. In LA, it's a response to a spurious claims about increase in crime in Washington, D.C. Um, but there is, a concern that if there were massive protests, that would give Trump basically the rationale to declare martial law. Um, I think what we have seen is that Trump is interested in doing this anyway, and that the lack of public protest will probably not make any difference in terms of his determination to concentrate power in his hands. Uh, what we saw in Poland and Hungary is that people courageously mobilized in the streets, even though they were threatened. I think most recently in Hungary, that was the case around the Pride March, that Orban basically said, we will arrest everybody, that this is a criminal gathering. And instead of staying home and being afraid, huge numbers of people came out into the streets. And not only that, they had um, European leaders from around the continent uh, march with them as a show of support to say that this is not normal. The situation in Hungary, the criminalizing of dissent and the criminalizing of LGBT activities, and we stand with our allies, with civil society in Hungary. Uh, so I think mobilizing on the streets in um, well, in a coordinated fashion in the United States on an issue by issue basis is going to be really important. In Poland, it turned out that the anti-abortion issue was perhaps the most galvanizing question. Um, and I think that here in this country, uh, you know, we have a number of issues that I think can bring people out onto the streets, whether it's a question of Trump's attacks on the judiciary, suspension um, of rule of law in particular parts of the country. But it's going to require kind of solidarity and I think some strategic thinking about where the greatest weak points are for the Trump administration. So, a no kings demonstration is certainly important in reminding people that there are large numbers of folks in the United States that oppose the Trump administration. But And it's certainly a umbrella-like term that can bring in a lot of folks who might disagree with one another if you push them on specific policy recommendations. But especially as we head towards midterm elections, I think we have to move away from no kings type framing of issues and really understand how, on an issue by issue basis, activists in Poland and Hungary were able to mobilize large numbers of people and block initiatives in parliament and really energize folks. I think again the corruption issue will possibly be a real sticking point for the Trump administration, because I think he came in promising to help the working class, people left behind by economic reform, and anything that can demonstrate that that isn't the case and that the federal dollars are flowing to the richest 1% or into Trump's pockets himself, I think could be a very effective strategy. Okay. Bunch of other questions now. So how are the differing opinions about Ukraine war in the two countries, likewise genocide in Palestine? Yes. So as I said, there's a real difference of opinion between Poland and Hungary on Ukraine. And the Orban administration has been perhaps the strongest defender of Putin administration, has been able to be a thorn in the side of the EU in particular in mobilizing support for Ukraine, has not been able to do so with NATO, in part because NATO is a hierarchical organization compared to the EU, which is a consensus-based organization. And this issue has also driven a wedge between what should be natural partners, ideologically speaking, between Hungary and Poland, between Fidesz and Law and Justice Party. Law and Justice Party and the Polish society more generally has supported Ukraine. There's been some difference of opinion around Ukrainian immigrants. The Law and Justice has been, more of an anti-immigrant party and has reflected some of the frustrations or resentments that non-Ukrainian Poles have felt towards Ukrainian immigrants. But the real challenge, I think, is the degree to which Hungary can undercut European solidarity on the Ukrainian issue, and how Trump will use that, if possible, to put pressure on Ukraine. He can say, oh, well, not all Europe supports Ukraine. We have Viktor Orban here, for instance, who has a very different opinion. And so that, I think, is potentially dangerous. On Israel, the European countries in general have been moving toward recognition of Palestine and a Palestinian state, even though, of course, Israel is now removing the material basis for a Palestinian state, with a green light given just actually this week for huge settlements in the West Bank, which would effectively cut West Bank in two. So the material basis for a Palestinian state is disappearing rapidly, and yet the move towards recognizing some potential Palestinian state is gaining ground in European circles. And Hungary, generally speaking, it has the largest, last time I looked, one of the largest, or Budapest had the largest Jewish population of a European city. That might have changed. I haven't looked recently. But, the relationship between Orban and Netanyahu as fellow far-right leaders is pretty strong. So I don't see Hungary and Poland really being at the forefront of, criticizing Israel or standing up for Palestinian rights, unfortunately. Another question, is there a new vision for American Democrats that can counteract the distrust of people in government? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, Poland and Hungary obviously come out of a tradition in which people had enormous distrust of government. They had distrust of communist government, and it was hard to overcome that in those early years. And the way that the early kind of liberal governments in Hungary and Poland went about it was to basically cut government. I mean, reduce government's role in the economy, cut government role in general, and kind of unleash power of rules. That was the case in Poland to strengthen what they call samorząd, or self-management, self-rule in this Polish countryside. Hungary is a little bit more centralized, but still the Hungarian government also kind of cut early on in the liberal period the government. And so that took advantage of people's distrust in government. Now people distrust government there for different reasons. I mean, the communist era is long gone, and they distrust government because of corruption. And for instance, in Poland, the Law and Justice Party has criticized the Donald Tusk government for corruption in the use of European funds. Now, you would think this is the greatest achievement of the Tusk government, is getting funds back from the European Union and using those stabilization funds to, improve the Polish economy. And yet, the Law and Justice Party has tried to diminish this one major success, saying that Tusk are corrupt and has used the money, a spa and a yacht. I mean, the money they're talking about is extremely small amount of the funds, and the funds are supposed to be for the help of small businesses. And in this case, it was a spa that was being supported. But the important thing here is that the charge of corruption carries with it such enormous weight that Law and Justice feels that even though it was accused of corruption, it can use those same accusations to undercut the support for the current prime minister and his government. And the same holds true with Hungary. And the only reason that Peter Magyar is not accused of corruption is because he divorced his wife, who was accused of corruption, and because he wasn't really in government in any significant way to accumulate charges of corruption. And his party is new enough that it hasn't, it hasn't ruled yet, hasn't been part of government, so it can't be accused of corruption. So here in the United States, we don't have the same kind of anti-corruption campaigns that have been popular in other countries throughout the global South, throughout Europe. A clean hands movement was very popular in Hungary for a time. Yes, there have been charges of corruption in New York with the mayor's office. There have been corrupt, Congress people, legislators who've been kicked out because of corruption, like the senator from New Jersey. But as for addressing presidential politics, corruption hasn't been a major plank. But I think that could change, and building not only on the successful examples that we see in Hungary and Poland, but on the successful examples of going after corrupt officials here in the United States. I think a broad-based anti-corruption campaign. It could be called something else if corruption doesn't have the kind of persuasiveness in focus group meetings. You can come up with something else that would be more that would have a greater resonance for American voters. But I do think that that's one way of combining concerns about economic inequality in this country and violations of the rule of law. So corruption lies at the kind of crossroads of those two powerful issues. And so I think for that reason, it can be potentially very successful strategy. Those are the questions we have. I really appreciate you all for for asking them. And I'll wait just a second just to see if there's any last questions, and then we can perhaps wrap things up a little early. Um, uh, and no, it looks like I have I have handled everything that people are interested in. So I'm going to thank you again. Remind you that this was a program from the Institute for Policy Studies. We're a think tank in Washington, D.C. You can see other events and other reports that we produce at ips-dc.org. We have a couple more programs in this series on the rise of authoritarianism around the world. And again, I'm John Pfeffer. I'm the Director of Foreign Policy and Focus. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and I will say goodbye to you now.